The darkness above the Pacific Ocean splits apart like torn fabric. Lightning tears through storm clouds on this March night in 1944. 2,000 feet below the churning surface, death waits in the black water. Inside the Kawanishi flying boat, Admiral Menachikoga feels his aircraft shake violently. Each thunderclap sounds like artillery fire. Rain pounds the metal hull with relentless fury. The Admiral's knuckles turn white as he grips his seat. But weather isn't his main concern tonight. Beside his feet sits a leather case. Inside that case lies Japan's final hope. The Z plan represents months of brilliant strategic thinking. Every calculation has been checked and rechecked. The finest naval minds in the Empire have contributed their expertise. This plan will destroy the American Pacific Fleet completely. The strategy seems flawless. American forces will advance from the east, as they always do. They'll assault Japan's fortress islands one by one. Jaluit, Mila, Wachai, Malawai Lab, these coral strongholds bristle with defensive positions. Thousands of determined soldiers man every gun. When the Americans exhaust themselves against these prepared positions, Japan's combined fleet will emerge. Like a sword from darkness, the fleet will annihilate what remains of American naval power. One decisive battle will end the Pacific War. Any rational commander would follow this approach. Attack the obvious targets. Fight where your enemy expects confrontation. This logical thinking gives Koga confidence as he stares into the storm. At 59 years old, he carries an empire's hopes. Following Admiral Yamamoto proves no simple task. The legendary architect of Pearl Harbor died before experiencing defeat. Now Koga must salvage victory from increasingly desperate circumstances. His aide leans close over the engine noise. The pilot suggests diverting to alternate airfields. No diversions, Koga responds sharply. His voice carries decades of command authority. We proceed to Davao as scheduled. The fleet awaits our arrival. What the Admiral cannot know changes everything. 600 miles away, American code breakers read his most classified communications. Filipino guerrillas have already recovered Z-plan documents from crashed aircraft. U.S. intelligence officers study every detail of Japan's perfect strategy. The Americans plan something even more shocking. They will ignore Japanese preparations entirely. While Koga's aircraft fights toward his watery grave, the U.S. Pacific Fleet prepares revolutionary warfare. The Americans will prove that superior firepower isn't war's most devastating weapon. Neither are better fortifications. The most destructive weapon is making your enemy's entire strategic framework irrelevant. How could Japan's most brilliant naval minds be so catastrophically wrong? The answer requires understanding Rear Admiral Manzo Akiyama's perspective on January 15, 1944. Morning sunlight reflects off crystal-clear lagoon water at Kwajalein Atoll. In the distance, concrete bunkers and gun emplacements represent months of grueling construction work. Akiyama commands the 6th Base Force from his headquarters. From Kwajalein, he coordinates defense across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. The responsibility weighs heavily on him. Everyone knows the Americans are advancing, but Akiyama feels no concern about Kwajalein itself. Why should he worry? The strategic situation in early 1944 follows predictable patterns. Americans attack obvious targets methodically. They grind forward through outer positions, step by bloody step. Tarawa cost them massive casualties. The Marshalls will prove equally expensive. American forces will throw themselves against heavily fortified outer islands where Japan remains strongest. The American mind operates methodically, Akiyama explains to his staff officers during morning briefings. They will assault Jaluit or Mila first. Perhaps Wotja follows. They lack imagination for anything else. His confidence stems from solid intelligence and decades of military experience. The outer Marshall Islands bristle with defensive positions beyond counting. Jaluit alone maintains over 3,500 troops and massive coastal guns. Mila boasts 2,530 soldiers and some of the Pacific's finest fortifications. These islands form an impenetrable barrier. Any rational enemy must neutralize them before advancing deeper into Japanese territory. Warfare has always operated this way. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz examines aerial reconnaissance photographs across his conference table. His intelligence officers have delivered a briefing that would seem impossible to Japanese strategists. American forces will bypass every major fortress island. They plan striking directly at the Marshall Island chain's heart. "Gentlemen," Nimitz announces, his finger tracing map lines that skip over Jaluit, Mila, and Watja entirely. "We advance straight to Kwajalein." Silence fills the room completely. Even American officers find the plan beyond audacious. Kwajalein isn't simply behind Japanese lines. It serves as the administrative center for the entire Marshall Island defense network. Attacking there resembled striking the enemy's brain while leaving his fists untouched. That's precisely the point. American intelligence discovered something Japanese commanders don't expect them to know. Kwajalein actually represents the weakest link in the defensive chain. While outer islands bristle with fortifications, Kwajalein maintains only 1,200 combat-effective troops. The rest of its 5,000-man garrison consists of Korean laborers, construction workers, and support personnel. Most have never held rifles in anger. Back on Kwajalein, Akiyama faces problems he doesn't fully comprehend yet. His diary entries, recovered after the battle, reveal increasing anxiety about American reconnaissance flights following no logical patterns. Enemy aircraft photograph areas making no strategic sense, he writes on January 20th. Why do they repeatedly overfly our lagoon approaches when our main defenses face the ocean? Their intelligence must be faulty. But Akiyama's confusion runs deeper than tactical puzzlement. Like every Japanese officer, he's trained in military tradition emphasizing decisive battle. Honor requires direct confrontation. Spiritual superiority comes from accepting the strongest enemy challenge. The concept that enemies might simply avoid your strengths doesn't compute. It's not just unfamiliar. It feels almost insulting. Consider Japanese mindset in early 1944. This military culture produced the samurai code. It reveres death before dishonor. Strategic retreat equals cowardice in their thinking. When Admiral Koga designed the Z Plan, he wasn't just creating military strategy. He was expressing fundamental Japanese beliefs about honorable warrior conduct. You meet enemy strength against strength. You fight where fighting proves hardest. You prove superiority through superior courage, superior discipline, superior willingness to die. Americans, the Japanese believe, must fight this way too. That's how real warfare is conducted. But what if Americans don't share these beliefs? What if they view war as a problem requiring efficient solutions? What if they're willing to win ugly, bypass honor for effectiveness? Let enemy fortresses wither while striking where enemies are weakest. On January 29, 1944, American carrier aircraft begin preliminary bombardment of Japanese positions throughout the Marshall Islands. But instead of concentrating on outer fortress islands as expected, they hit targets scattered across the entire chain. Akiyama watches from his command bunker as explosions bloom across distant atolls. They're softening up everything. his communications officer reports. Jaluit, Mila, Wotje, Majuro, and Sir, they're hitting us here too. Akiyama nods grimly. Finally, Americans are revealing their intentions. This widespread bombing campaign confirms Japanese expectations. Americans are preparing systematic assault on multiple fortress positions. It will cost them dearly, but at least it makes strategic sense. What Akiyama doesn't realize is that he's witnessing naval history's most sophisticated deception operation. Americans aren't softening targets for invasion. They're hiding true intentions behind universal destruction. The real blow comes tomorrow. When it falls, everything changes. January 31st, 1944, 5:47 a.m. The first explosion shatters pre-dawn silence over Kwajalein Atoll like the world ending. Admiral Akiyama bolts upright in his bunk as his entire command bunker shakes violently. Concrete dust falls from the ceiling in gray streams. Outside, naval gunfire thunder rolls across the lagoon in continuous devastating waves. Through the narrow observation slit in his bunker wall, he sees muzzle flashes lighting up the horizon like deadly stars. But something's wrong with this picture. Terribly, impossibly wrong. "Sir!" His aide bursts through the bunker door. Helmet askew, eyes wide with shock. The American fleet. They're not where they're supposed to be. Akiyama grabs his binoculars and rushes to the observation post. What he sees through magnified lenses defies everything he thought he knew. About warfare, about Americans, about the fundamental nature of military strategy itself. The U.S. Pacific Fleet isn't attacking Jaluit. It isn't pounding massive fortifications at Mila or Wotje. Instead, 8 American battleships sit in Kwajalein Lagoon, inside his defensive perimeter, methodically destroying everything in sight with industrial machinery precision. "How did they get past our outer defenses?" Akiyama whispers, his voice barely audible over bombardment. The answer is as simple as it is revolutionary. They didn't go past outer defenses. They went around them. While Japanese commanders spent months preparing for frontal assaults on fortress islands, Americans developed something entirely new. A strategy so audacious it didn't exist in Japanese military thinking. They called it island hopping. That bland term completely fails to capture the psychological devastation about to unfold. The USS New Mexico opens fire with 14-inch guns. Each shell weighs as much as a small automobile. The first salvo brackets the main command bunker. The second finds its range. Akiyama watches in horrified fascination as his carefully constructed defensive positions simply cease to exist under methodical American bombardment. But naval gunfire is just the opening act. At 6:15 a.m., the sky fills with aircraft engine drones, not the handful of planes that might support traditional amphibious assault. Wave after wave of carrier aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters. More aircraft than Akiyama has ever seen in his life. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nabata, stationed at the airfield, records in his diary what happens next. The enemy planes came out of the sun like locusts. Our fighters tried to respond, but they were outnumbered 20-1. I watched zero after zero fall burning into the lagoon until there were no more zeros left to fall. By 7 a.m., 92 of 110 Japanese aircraft in the Marshall Islands have been destroyed. The remainder flee to distant bases. Island garrisons remain completely defenseless against air attack. This is the moment when Japanese strategic thinking doesn't just fail. It shatters completely. You must understand, every Japanese plan for defending the Marshall Islands was based on the assumption that Americans would fight like Japanese. They would attack strongest points first. Seek decisive battle. Accept massive casualties for the honor of direct confrontation. Outer fortress islands were supposed to attract American attention. Draw them into grinding, attritional warfare where Japanese spiritual superiority could triumph over American material advantages. Instead, Americans treated Japanese fortress islands like obstacles to avoid rather than challenges to meet. They left 11,000 Japanese troops on outer islands to wither, starving, cut off from supplies, militarily irrelevant, while striking at the one point where Japanese defenses were thinnest. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders is immediate and devastating. Colonel Tarokichi Aso, commanding 729 men of the Wotje detachment who had just arrived at Kwajalein for transfer, stares at the American fleet through his field glasses. "This is not warfare," he mutters to his aide. "This is something else entirely." What Aso witnesses is modern asymmetric warfare's birth. The idea that victory comes not from defeating enemy strength, but from making his strength irrelevant. At 9:30 a.m., the first American landing craft hit the beaches. Major General Charles Corlitt's 7th Infantry Division doesn't charge into withering defensive fire like Marines did at Tarawa. Instead, they wade ashore on beaches so thoroughly pulverized by naval gunfire that one British observer later wrote, "Nothing could have lived through that sea and air bombardment." The beach was a mass of brightly colored fish that had been thrown up there by nearby explosions. Prepared Japanese defenses, gun positions, concrete bunkers, carefully sited machine gun nests have been reduced to rubble and smoking craters. Most Korean laborers and support personnel surrender immediately. They never expected to fight any battle at all. But it's not just physical destruction that breaks Japanese resistance. It's complete psychological disorientation of fighting an enemy who refuses to follow the rules. Akiyama retreats to his final command bunker. He tries desperately to coordinate defense against an attack that shouldn't be happening. His radio crackles with confused reports from surviving units. "Sir, Americans have landed at 3 different points simultaneously. They're using some kind of amphibious tanks. We've never seen anything like them. Our coastal guns can't depress low enough to hit their landing craft in the lagoon. Every defensive plan, every carefully prepared position, every tactical doctrine developed over decades of military training has become useless overnight. Americans aren't just winning. They're winning so easily that Japanese resistance collapses into bewildered chaos." By noon, American forces have advanced halfway across Kwajalein Island. By evening, organized Japanese resistance has effectively ended. In less than 18 hours, the administrative center of Japanese power in the Marshall Islands has fallen to an enemy attack that Japanese strategic doctrine insisted was impossible. The numbers tell their own devastating story. Out of 5,000 Japanese on Kwajalein, only 265 survived as prisoners. American casualties number just 177 killed and 1,000 wounded. It's not a battle. It's systematic demolition carried out with industrial efficiency. But perhaps the most shocking moment comes when Akiyama, wounded and trapped in his final bunker, realizes Americans aren't even planning to attack the fortress islands at all. Radio intercepts reveal that Jaluit, Mila, and Wotje, the supposedly critical defensive positions that absorbed so much Japanese effort and resources, are simply being bypassed. 11,000 Japanese soldiers will spend the rest of the war sitting on heavily fortified islands that no longer matter to anyone. As American soldiers finally breach his command bunker, Akiyama experiences something no Japanese officer had ever been trained to process: the complete irrelevance of everything he thought he knew about warfare. Americans hadn't just defeated Japanese defenses. They had made Japanese defenses meaningless. Standing in the smoking ruins of his command post, surrounded by American soldiers who look more like factory workers than samurai warriors, Akiyama understands with crystal clarity that this is not just tactical defeat. It's the end of an entire way of thinking about war, honor, and the nature of military conflict itself. The age of fortress warfare, of meeting strength with strength, of proving superiority through direct confrontation, dies with him in that bunker on Kwajalein Atoll. What's being born in its place will reshape not just the Pacific War, but the entire future of global conflict. The silence in Admiral Soyomu Toyota's office in Tokyo is deafening. It's February 8, 1944, 1 week after Kwajalein's fall. Toyota, newly appointed to replace deceased Admiral Koga, stares at intelligence reports that read like science fiction. Americans have captured the heart of the Marshall Island Defense Network in 4 days. 11,000 Japanese troops remain stranded on outer islands that Americans simply ignored. The entire strategic framework of Japanese Pacific defense has collapsed like a house of cards. How? Toyota asks his intelligence officer. How did we miss this completely? The answer sits in a manila folder on his desk. The captured Z plan that Filipino guerrillas had fished from crashed aircraft months earlier. Every Japanese defensive position, every strategic assumption, every tactical doctrine had been laid bare to American intelligence. But even more devastating than this intelligence failure was the deeper psychological blindness it revealed. Japanese military thinking had become trapped in its own cultural assumptions. The belief that honor required meeting enemy strength directly. The conviction that Americans would fight like Japanese, seeking decisive battle where defenses were strongest. The inability to conceive that an enemy might simply walk away from your strengths to strike at your weaknesses. For surviving Japanese commanders like Toyota, the shock was transformational and permanent. Post-war interrogations reveal officers who describe feeling like they had been fighting ghosts. An enemy that refused to behave predictably. That treated war as an engineering problem rather than a test of spiritual strength. Lieutenant Commander Nabata, one of the few survivors from Kwajalein's airfield, later wrote, "We spent months preparing for the wrong war. While we built fortresses, they built flexibility. While we concentrated forces, they concentrated intelligence. While we prepared for battle, they prepared to avoid battle entirely." The psychological impact rippled throughout the Japanese military hierarchy. Field commanders began second-guessing every defensive plan. Was this position too obvious? Would Americans simply bypass it? How do you defend against an enemy that refuses to attack your defenses? But Americans weren't finished revolutionizing warfare. What happened in the Marshalls was just the beginning. Over following months, U.S. forces would leapfrog across the Pacific with devastating efficiency. The Mariana Islands fell in summer 1944, bringing B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. The Philippines were reconquered through brilliant tactical bypassing of Japanese strongpoints combined with amphibious assaults. Each victory validated the new American way of war. Strike where the enemy is weakest. Make his strength irrelevant. Win through superior intelligence and operational flexibility rather than superior courage. The human cost of Japanese strategic miscalculation was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers found themselves marooned on bypassed islands, slowly starving while the war moved past them. They had been prepared to die gloriously in battle. Instead, they died slowly and pointlessly, victims of a strategic doctrine that had been rendered obsolete overnight. Today, military strategists study the Marshall Islands campaign as modern asymmetric warfare's birth. Principles pioneered by American forces in 1944 became the foundation for everything from Cold War proxy conflicts to contemporary counterterrorism operations. Avoid enemy strengths. Exploit intelligence advantages. Prioritize operational speed over tactical perfectionism. But perhaps the most important lesson is psychological rather than tactical. Japanese commanders shocked by American island hopping weren't stupid or incompetent. They were trapped by their own cultural assumptions about how wars should be fought, how enemies should behave, how honor and effectiveness should balance against each other. In boardrooms and military academies around the world, the story of Japanese strategic blindness has become a cautionary tale about assumption-based planning dangers. How many businesses have failed by assuming competitors would follow traditional patterns? How many military campaigns have crumbled when enemies refuse to fight the expected battle? The storm that claimed Admiral Koga's life on March 31, 1944, was more than just meteorological accident. It was symbolic of the tempest that American strategic innovation was about to unleash across the Pacific. Japanese commanders had prepared for everything except an enemy that would change war's rules itself. Standing in Kwajalein Atoll's ruins, surrounded by obsolete defensive thinking debris, Rear Admiral Akiyama had witnessed something that military historians would later recognize as a turning point in human conflict. The age of fortress warfare was ending. The age of maneuver warfare, information warfare, and strategic flexibility had begun. Americans hadn't just shocked Japanese commanders with their island-hopping strategy. They had shocked the world into new understanding of what warfare could become when intelligence, innovation, and audacity combined to make the impossible inevitable. The lesson echoes through decades. Strategic assumptions can become strategic blindness. Cultural beliefs can become cultural traps. Yesterday's successful patterns can become tomorrow's fatal weaknesses. In military conflict, business competition, and personal challenges, the most dangerous enemy is often the one who refuses to play by your rules, who sees your strengths as obstacles to avoid rather than challenges to meet, who understands that winning ugly beats losing honorably. The wreckage of Japanese defensive positions scattered across Pacific atolls stands as permanent testimony to a simple truth. The most devastating weapon in any conflict isn't superior firepower or better fortifications. It's the ability to make your enemy's entire strategic framework completely irrelevant.